evening, YouTube. This is going to be a video response to The Naked Atheist, which is like the coolest name I've ever heard on YouTube. Seriously, I don't care who you are. That's an amazing name. The Naked Atheist, who responded to Veritas 48 Dollar Films and my request for arguments against the existence of God. Specifically, The Naked Atheist posted a video of someone else talking about how belief in God is a psychological projection. Therefore, belief in God is irrational to hold. So in other words, belief in God and God's existence is nothing more than a psychological projection of wish fulfillment or fear, etc. However, this argument is severely flawed in arguing that the alleged naturalistic belief-forming mechanism that created belief in God, if such a thing exists, therefore disproves God's existence, just doesn't work. And let me quickly expound on why this is. First, if this is in fact how one wants to argue, then this criticism can cut both ways. Some people may embrace religion because of fear of death, etc., but it is equally possible that some people might embrace anti-religion because they fear ultimate accountability, have difficulty dealing with inferiority, or cannot cope with being a dependent creature. Thus, anti-theism could equally be charged with being itself a form of projective denial. Moreover, psychologist Paul Vitz argues that if one is going to give an account of which is more possibly a psychological projection, then it would be atheism over theism. Now, while I would never argue against a position using psychological projection, since I think it's severely logically flawed, Vitz argues nonetheless that conversion to Christianity and other religions fails to fit tight control groups, for converts come into all kinds of personality types, states in life, and different circumstances in time, place, and education, whereas atheists fit a more tightly defined control group. Second, it does not really matter how a belief is generated if the question at issue is the truth of the belief. In fact, anyone who argues that belief in God exists simply because it is originated in fear or other psychological commitments commits the genetic fallacy. Where a belief comes from is a different matter than why one should believe it. The former involves psychology of discovery, the latter the epistemology of justification. Hence, this is why I don't hold to Vitz's argument that atheism is more likely the position as psychological projection. However, if one argues the fallacious reasoning, then he should at least acknowledge that his argument against theism is severely in danger of a tu quoque argument, counter-argument against his position, as one describes. Third, specifically to Christianity, the Christian God is not one that a human being would likely willingly project. The biblical God is holy, demanding, omnipotent, omniscient, and awesome in justice. If one were going to project a God to meet one's needs, a being much tamer and much more human and much more manageable would be a better candidate than the God of Yahweh in the Bible. One could expect, for example, a God of the New Age Universalist would seem a lot more likely. Fourth, if we assume for the sake of argument that belief in God is a psychological projection, and if we further assume that neo-Darwin evolution is correct, then natural selection produced the faculties and cognitive structures with which we form beliefs and pursue science and God. But if the governing aim of a belief-producing mechanism, such as natural selection, aims for reproductivity instead of truth, then exactly the same principle poses potential problems for the scientific beliefs and for the anti-religious arguments produced by cognitive faculties developed by the Darwinian process, ultimately directed towards enhancing reproductive fitness. Moreover, in order for such a critique to work, two criteria must be met. First, there must be a plausible case made that the source of the belief in God in question is in fact the actual source, i.e. natural selection versus reformed epistemology's basic belief. Second, a case must be made that the religion-producing tendencies are unreliable, meaning that God does not place them in us exactly for the purpose of alerting us to spiritual matters. Now, I think this is a burden of proof that is simply too heavy to bear by the one who wishes to argue that belief in God and vicariously God's existence is false exclusively on the unsubstantiated notion of psychological projection. I think that's a very weak argument. Lastly, the objector may try at least one way to establish that belief in God is still based on the dubious psychological tenets. They could argue that instead of falsifying belief in God, that the psychological projection instead demonstrates that belief in God is unwarranted. The problem with the move from humans naturally forming beliefs in certain things, i.e. God, to those beliefs being unwarranted seems like special pleading, however. Consider that humans naturally, it seems, form beliefs in other things, for example, minds, reliability of our senses, the reliability of our memory, with warrant. So what is the distinction between the two? One could argue that belief in the reliability of our senses and memory is caused directly, whereas belief in God is indirect. However, this simply begs a question against religious experience, and so is not a very good counter-argument. So concisely then, I do not think that arguing that God does not exist because belief in God is a psychological projection in the mind is a logical or even adequate way to argue against the existence of God, or provide rational justification for non-theism. It's just not a good argument. I'd like to thank The Naked Atheist for his video response and his username. Peace.